Great. Welcome everyone to another Digital Humanities Research Hub seminar. I'm Ruth Ahnert, postdoc research fellow in Digital Humanities here at the Hub, and it's my great pleasure to welcome here today with us Ruth and Daniel. For those joining online, I'm just going to give you quick housekeeping instructions. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please message Michael in the chat, and we'll do our best to assist you. I think everything will be fine. We will be recording today's session. So if you do not want to appear on the recording, for the people joining in person, just let me know. And for the people joining, online, all is sorted for you. So following today's talk, there will be a Q&A session. We will take questions for both our online and in-person audience. Questions should be asked with respect and generosity in a way that promotes dialogue rather than shutting it down. And in this way, speakers and attendees can contribute to the inclusive and welcoming ethos that is central to our work at the Digital Humanities Research Hub here in the School of Advanced Study. So it's a great pleasure to welcome today, as I said, Ruth and Daniel. They're going to speak on this exciting project, building sustainable communities around data and software. So let me introduce our speakers for today. So Ruth Ahnert is Professor of Literary History and Digital Humanities at Queen Mary University of London. Her research sits at the intersection of early modern literary history, archival studies, and data science. Her books include Tudor Networks of Power, a co-author with Sebastian E, collaborative historical research in the age of big data, co-authored with Emma Griffin, Ridge and Giogia Tolfo, and with Network Term, co-authored with Sebastian E and Catherine Coleman and Scott Weingart, and also the earliest one, The Rise of Prison Literature in the 16th Century. She was PI of the Living with Machines project for 5 years until August 2023. And now she's co-I on this new exciting project, Data Culture, at the Alan Turing Institute. And Daniel Wilson is a historian of science and technology working on the politics and provenance of data and machines in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. His work combines traditional close reading and archival study with computational techniques. Current projects include using language models and other critical methods to explore historical datasets, including the internationally important collections of the British Library. And prior to being appointed Turing Research Fellow, Daniel was Senior Research Associate on the Living with Machines project, which is a radical collaboration between historians, curators, data scientists, and computational linguists. The project explored the Industrial Revolution in Britain using digital methods, including computer vision on historical map collection and much more. We are here to hear you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having us here today. We're really delighted, Daniel and I, to have been invited, and we're going to be speaking about, well, kind of both about the recently completed project with Living with Machines as a case study for our new project, Data Culture, Building Sustainable Communities Around Data and Software. So a bit of backstory about Living with Machines for those who don't know about it. The project, as Anna-Marie said, ran from 2018 to 2023, and it started out as a conversation between the British Library and the Alan Turing Institute. It was a kind of high-level strategic discussion about how the British Library and the Alan Turing had these kind of complementary offerings, that the British Library had data that it was producing at scale. It had all of these digitized collections, and the Alan Turing Institute had the kind of potential to wrangle that data at scale. However, the Turing had absolutely no history of working with cultural heritage data, and so this was an experiment for everybody involved. So Living with Machines could be described on the one hand as a data-driven history project, or we could flip it and say it was a history-focused data science project. But the kind of starting contention, it's not progressing, is it?
Yeah, it's not progressing. So let's.
That should be slide 3. Let's try again.
Yeah, let's give it a try.
There we go. So the kind of starting contention for us was that this sort of untapped depth of digital archives means that there remains a lot that can be learned from the human, social, and cultural consequences of the coming of the machine age. Can you see the bridge, or can you see that slide? You can see that slide. So yeah, our aims were fourfold. So on the one hand, we wanted to kind of think about the kind of computational means of marshalling digitized collections at scale as a kind of experiment in what is possible right now with the data available and the kind of technology available. But we also wanted to develop new innovative computational models, tools, and code and infrastructure components that were kind of responsive to those humanistic questions we might have, but could also, and this is kind of what's key in this talk, would be transferable to other projects in the future. And the aim of all of that was to kind of ideally facilitate new historical findings about the lives of ordinary people and the effective mechanization. And then the kind of meta aim of the project was to deliver all of that through a process of radical collaboration. So the project was really guided by values of open research. And so we've really sought to kind of make our data and code available, kind of along the lines of best practice. You know, you can find our code on GitHub. I think we've got about 80 different code repos on there that are open. The things that we digitize in our data sets are all on the BL research repository. You can find an overview of the project on our website, and we're actually really excited because I think you had your relaunch of the University of London Press yesterday. We're going to be publishing our book with them, and so it's going to be a really nice focal place where, because it's an interactive platform, you can kind of access all of these different kind of digital assets from our project, as well as the book itself, which is all in good. But this kind of idea of research being reproducible, that data and code can be reused, is an aspiration, but there is also a question around how reproducible are these things really? Are we really ensuring that they can be reused, that they are useful, that they are usable and actually being used? So we're really interested in that gap and how you actually ensure reuse and good return on investment. So that's the point of our current initiative at the Shearing, Data Culture. So Living with Machines is a case study on the pilot version of this project. And the contention is that lots of projects produce data, lots of projects produce code, but the extent to which those products are then used outside of the project is very debatable. It's the very few that get reused and reused. And this is not a great return on investment for funders like the AHRC. And so they're very interested in thinking about how they can actually get reuse of those things. But it is actually also really disheartening when you've spent, say, 5 years of your life creating these things and they're not picked up in the way that you initially imagined them to be. So this pilot project, if successful, will provide models of thinking about how to identify assets that actually would be useful to a wider community, and then making it useful and usable by making sure it's properly documented, but then doing the community building around it to ensure that it's actually being used, to identify the people who would find it useful, and then to optimize the outputs in ways that really serve those communities. So today we're going to be talking about Living with Machines because it's a nice case study, because we did produce a lot of assets. And I'm thinking about how we might go around building an active community of users around those assets. I'm going to hand over to Daniel now.
Thanks, Ruth, and to Anna Maria, and hi, everyone. So as Anna Maria said, I was one of the researchers on the Living with Machines project. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some research that came out of the project, again, as a way of sort of highlighting what our approach was. I'm going to focus in particular on MapReader, which is an end-to-end computer vision pipeline for analysing images at scale. So MapReader is just one tool that came out of the project. And like many others, it took a digitized form of source material, transformed it in one way or another into research data in a way that was open and reproducible. But just before diving into MapReader in some detail, I'll just step back briefly and give you a higher level outline of the way that maps were just one type of source material used in the project. Now, I know many in DH are converting handwriting to TypeScript. I'm doing the opposite here. And this is very schematic, but it's just to give you a kind of sense of this. So in all of these cases, something similar was undertaken. So in yellow, on the left, you see a type of source. In red and turquoise, you see either a tool, a pipeline, some process of transformation, ending in a recognizable and shareable data format, in green here. In each case, the aim was to arrive in blue with what we call research-ready data, okay, which is structured, enriched, and in our case, in every case, well, in our case, it's geospatial too. So with maps, you see at the top there, a journey from an image through the creation of labels or annotations via the MapReader pipeline to structured tabular data derived from the maps, which ends as CSV files that anyone can use. Okay, so I'll say more about this in a minute, but just to give a flavor for those perhaps not interested in working with maps, we have something very similar for newspaper data, taken initially from various large digitized collections, processed by an open tool we built called Alto to Text, which transforms very verbose Alto XML to more manageable text files, to which we can now add toponym detection via a new tool they're called TRES, which finds and then outputs place names mentioned in any newspaper article or articles, fine-tuned for 19th century geographies. In addition to this, perhaps the most valuable for historians of the 19th century, on the bottom here, we have information taken originally from newspaper press directories, so reference works published in the 19th century, which we digitized and which are now openly available, which were structured via our NPD pipeline developed by our colleague Casper Bielan, together with some machine learning, to produce extremely rich and granular metadata about the newspapers in the above collections, which we can connect to the full text of those newspapers in order to evaluate things like the representativeness and the bias of a given article or articles. So highly valuable new research data. So, okay, that worked. So moving now from right to left on the same principle, we've used census data at the top there in yellow, which arrived to us as a highly restrictive, anonymized and aggregated data set, not really usable, which we've now transformed into a form in which it can be, with some caveats, used to understand who lived where in historical census years from the late 19th century. And this was done using a tool currently called StreetCoder, developed by our colleague Josh Rhodes, which will soon be published. And this outputs CSV files of populations grouped by streets, and which can be filtered by the variables originally in the census, as well as new ones created by the researcher. And finally, just to finish, an example of information about railway stations, previously available, but only if you were familiar with the world of local transport historians and enthusiasts, who were very happy for us to take their work, previously published in yearly books, and transform it using a method we called station to station into a new and open data set of all historical railway stations in the country, which we've now published again in the form of a CSV. And that data set is called StopsGB, and you can find it easily, available for anyone to use, and which has been a key ingredient for our own ongoing research. So in all these cases, the aim has been to make every step in these transformations clearly documented, public and reproducible as we generate the research data that we wanted and we hope other people will want and use for their own work. Right, so what does this process look like in practice? So it'll always be different depending on the research question, the source material, and the choice of method. But I'll now just run you very rapidly through the logic behind the MapReader pipeline, how it developed in response to a number of research questions, and how we've worked not only to make its outputs open in the passive sense of publication, which is obviously the cornerstone of research in the end, but also as we now seek more actively to cultivate a community of users. So this will be quite condensed, and I can maybe expand on some of the detail afterwards of how this works, but I just want to give you a sense now of the overall approach. Okay, so as Ruth mentioned, the research aim of Living with Machines was to find new ways to understand the impact of industrialization on people's lives in the long 19th century. Now, a central aspect of capturing the lived experience lies in understanding where things are in the past who was in proximity to what. So ordnance survey maps are an extraordinarily powerful source for investigating this question. They're the first maps to be scientifically surveyed and printed with coverage of the entire nation. So as you can see in this detail from a late 19th century sheet of Cardiff, the information in these maps provides unparalleled insights to the ways that the physical manifestation of industrialization, factories, mills, railways, and more, transformed communities, but these have never previously been used at scale. So one aspect of life in industrial Britain that was a key ingredient of this transformation was the railway. And so we set out to explore how rail was experienced and wanted to explore who benefited from the arrival of rail and who suffered the consequences. So to do this, we had to imagine new units of spatial analysis that were amenable to the sources and to the methods that we had available. So the requirements for MapReader were therefore to allow us to translate visual features into analytical concepts, to transform map content as structured, labeled, and machine-readable data, to generate high-resolution data at the national scale, to create novel categories of analysis, and importantly, to combine its output with other datasets. And there were two other requirements we had for MapReader, which are important to what we're going to talk about today. And they were for its core methods to be iterative and reproducible. So historical OS maps tell us how Victorians represented the British landscape and how that landscape was changing. Similarly, our own understanding of the maps would change as we iterated our own research questions, which is a process we make explicit for others to see and understand. And the other requirement was that it be fast, because there are way too many maps to examine with close reading, hundreds of thousands of sheets, and machine learning makes it possible for us to work with these large collections quickly and effectively. Okay, so because we were not interested in pixel level precision on the maps, we adopted a method common from biomedical imaging, in which a parent image, in our case, an old map sheet, is divided into smaller regions using a customizable grid, which produces small squares on the map, typically 100 meters square, that we call patches. Okay, so patches are therefore a new shape and type of data for historical or geographical research, which are useful because they can be easily and quickly marked up or annotated according to the presence or absence of a given feature, which in machine learning is its label. Okay. So a huge advantage of this approach is that the labels we give patches are open-ended and versatile and can vary entirely depending on the wishes of the researcher. So for our research, we created, to begin with, a new geographical label we called rail space, which signifies the presence of any rail infrastructure within a given patch. Now, this was a powerful way of working because the existing sources, so vectorized maps of railway networks, do not in fact give you any reliable guide to the location of the railway in the landscape. So we used historical maps to do this, and this was the first time it had been done in this way. So visual information taken from this set of 6-inch OS maps from the 19th century was captured by our manually labeling 62,000 patches, or 62,000, which we then used to train a vision model. That model was subsequently able to predict or infer rail space across the entire national collection of maps, automatically labeling 30 million patches. Okay, so we've now published both of these data sets, both the expert annotated and the model predictions. Now, we then use these patches, as it were, to reconstruct the presence of railway infrastructure in a way that's built up from the ground using MapReader's classifications. What this allows us to do is capture rail space in its complexity and variety and in all the ways it was inscribed in the landscape. Once we have this, we're then able to begin our analysis back in relation to people, which is kind of where we started. So just very quickly, just to give you a playful sense of what this looks like, here are some examples of what the vision model predicts as rail space with highest confidence. And these are just tiled in a sort of random shuffle, just to show you what they look like out of context. To give you a sense of where this method can go, we repeated this procedure, but for a different label, in this case, buildings. And again, here are some examples tiled randomly, just to show you what they look like out of context. But the real power of the method is in the way these different labels or classifications can be compounded together to create whole new categories in combination, such as, you might have guessed, rail and buildings. Okay, patches where you have both rail and building in 100 meter square. Now, this is still at a rudimentary stage, but hopefully you can begin to get a sense of the power of this method. So, if you install and run MapReader for yourself, what do you get? Okay, so it runs in Jupyter notebooks. You take in your input, your image input, from a wide range of sources, web tile servers, locally stored files, whatever you have. These might be georeferenced or they might not be. It can do either. You can then process, you can annotate, and then predict if you want to do predictions on those images. And then you can output in a range of formats. So either the images themselves, which could be georeferenced if they are from a map or not, if not, or if you're working with older maps that aren't georeferenced. But most importantly and most valuably, metadata about the location of your target phenomena in those maps, which is available either in CSV or JSON format. Okay. Now, because our output is in one of these widely used formats, the results can be plotted and displayed using any tool you prefer to visualize and also to evaluate your results. So here you just see a tiny example of a local snapshot of MapReader outputs for rail space, which is in gray, and buildings in blue in their actual geographical positions, as well as showing you the results of our evaluation of precision and recall for these particular tasks, which are reasonably good in this example, over 97%. So the ability to plot outputs from MapReader comes into its own when you begin to combine it with other data sets you may have. So in our case, if you remember, we had census information as well as railway stations, which then allows you to produce very sophisticated research visualizations like this, which is work in progress from a forthcoming history paper we call Beyond the Tracks, which hopefully will be in this manifold University of London Press book before too long, into which we can add back in the people. So in here you see the black squares are rail space patches, which we can also analyze by their density, as well as just presence or absence. The circles here are passenger stations from the Stops GB dataset I mentioned, and the streets here are color-coded by the affluence of the residential households that we estimate from the census. So all of which begins to tell us a story about who got the benefits of this newly developing railway infrastructure and who merely lived with the pollution, the smoke, and the noise, all of which I think is very powerful and very cool. So what's the current status of MapReader? Okay, so it lives as a software library already, but our goal is to expand its usefulness beyond living with machines in line with the open research principles we've been advocating. We want people to join us, and our aim is to lower barriers and build skills for computational humanities and GLAM researchers, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums who might be or might yet become interested. So on the left here, you see our Read the Docs page, which we're quite proud of, which you can find very easily by searching for MapReader. It's now quite thorough. On our GitHub repository, which is linked, or you can equally find by searching, you can create an issue and interact with us there. All of the data is freely available on Zenodo, again, which is an open repository, links to which are easy to find, as well as on Hugging Face, which is a free sort of hub for machine learning information. Now, also, because we work closely with the National Library of Scotland, in fact, who gave us the maps in the first place, we've reshared our MapReader outputs back with the NLS, who have an excellent repository of their own called the Data Foundry. And there, the fabulous map librarian Chris Fleet has built his own visualization there where you can see and interact with the outputs of our rail space experiments. And that's all, you can sort of look at it on their website. And I recommend looking at the NLS Maps website if you haven't. On the right, I just wanted to show this mention of a prize we were very honored to receive a few months ago from the American Historical Association, which was sponsored by the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, for which we're very grateful, not only for the recognition of the work of our large team, but also because the prize included funding for student bursaries to attend our forthcoming workshops, where you and anyone else is welcome to come and learn to use MapReader. So, just before handing back to Ruth, I wanted to share this slide, which comes from the Software Sustainability Institute, which is a handy guide of the possible progress of software towards infrastructure. Okay, so we were here, my slide has fallen off, but we were somewhere around here. Now we're gradually moving along this trajectory to the right.
It comes back.
Oh yeah,
It's a build.
that's weird. Yeah, there's two of them. Anyway, so yeah, we've published a research paper early on in this process in the SIG Spatial, which is kind of geoscience venue, which outlines the code, the method, the principles, the software library. But now we're moving beyond research code presented in a paper to a tool that can be used not just to reproduce our own experiments, but for others to design their experiments with many different types of digitized maps, or indeed any image collections that might be suitable. So we've already got introduced and improved documentation, which is now pretty comprehensive. There's clearer licensing and contribution guidelines via our GitHub. There's more tests, user testing. We're now starting code reviews with colleagues from the DH Tech section of the ADHO, which is a digital humanities organization. And next, we're hoping we can share the actual models, which we generate for specific labels, the evaluation output material that we've been creating as we go, and finally, to just build the community of historians and other digital humanists using MapReader. So those are our next steps, and hopefully this will, there we are. Okay, we're there now. We may move further to the right.
Yes. So thanks to Daniel for that overview, and we're really proud of MapReader as an outcome of Living Machines. But we've been talking about it today not to kind of like blow our trumpet, but to think about MapReader as an example of how you go about building something that meets specific research needs, and then thinking about how it become more generalizably applicable to people, but then how you might kind of generate a user community around it. But I think it's kind of a useful way of like stepping back and thinking about the larger challenges we have as a community, to think about how we create communities around digital assets, from data to software, and what that looks like in terms of the kind of future of research infrastructure around digital humanities in the UK. So we're still talking a lot about the potential of things like MapReader, and we think the payoff comes from it being actively used. And as scholars, we're actually just not that experienced at how do you go about creating a community. We don't have the training to do that. We have our training in like how to go into an archive and like read things for ages, or you might be used to kind of tinkering with your code for months. Building communities is not our thing. So we are working on this current project, and eventually we're going to be having some new members of the team who are research application managers who are kind of actually more trained to do this work, to think about how we move from good practice to kind of better practice. So I think now in the digital humanities community, we're all quite used to publishing our data on a data repo with a fairly permissive license. And that's kind of like, but that's the kind of standard, isn't it? So we want to think about what better practice looks like. So how does it become findable? That kind of findability that we're putting that stuff out there and we're just hoping that people find it because it's attached to a publication. But how do people find something that might have a kind of sideways application to their work? And one of the issues here is the kind of infrastructure we have in the UK at the moment. So if you're a project funded by ESRC, your data has to go into the UK Data Service. But we haven't had an equivalent to that for the AHRC since they removed the funding in 2008. There is no current kind of central AHRC-like, repository for arts and humanities research data. And they might think we don't need one because we do have university research repositories, but that creates a massive siloing effect. People are using Zenodo, but it means that stuff is scattered across multiple locations. So that's an issue, the sort of siloing effect. Also, the downside, of course, of a central repository is sustainability. If there's an attack, we're all aware of the kind of BL ransomware attack. So there is something about distributed infrastructure that we do have to recognise. Also, just the publishing your data is one thing, but what is good published data? It comes to good documentation. So we might look to really good standards like the Library of Congress. They've started publishing their data with data cards, which kind of gives good descriptions of the contents of data sets. And there is a growing community of people who are publishing their data with accompanying data papers. So that's not a repo in and of itself. You tend to publish it on Zenodo or somewhere, but then you produce a data paper which documents the process through which your data's been. So these are all ways in which people are trying to do the best things, but it's created a kind of scattershot approach where people don't know how to find things. It's in all number of places to all number of standards. So we want to think about what the kind of future looks like that. Is there a way of networking all of those efforts? Could Research Fish actually become something good? Research Fish is horrible. I'm doing it at the moment for 3 different projects. But maybe if it actually collected and indexed information about data sets across projects, allowing us to search across all of these millions of repositories in different places, that could become a good thing. But then, of course, you have the problem of the wealth of riches. And so the question then is, how do we start gathering around what look like canonical data sets, really important data sets for people to gather around and say, actually, this can become a standard whereby we sort of benchmark our research. So we want to think a little bit about actually how we decide as a community what those data sets are, how we then build activity around them through workshops or summer schools to stimulate new projects. And so this is, I've been talking about this from a data perspective, but this kind of also holds for software, but there are some additional problems. So again, best practice. At the moment, everyone's publishing their data on GitHub. We just really hope it stays there because all of our plans are based on GitHub being there ad infinitum. But there are some other kind of attitudinal issues that kind of sit behind this problem. There is the attitude of build it and they will come, which I think a lot of our kind of software engineering friends are like, yeah, why do we need to worry about maintaining stuff? Like, people will gather around it, but I don't think our historian colleagues necessarily know MapReader is there yet. And so you do need to work out how to get a community gathered around it. And that's an issue of findability. But I think one of the biggest issues is maintenance, because we all know, if we've been on projects, that when the project money stops, human time allocated to that thing stops, unless it's your pet project, and then you give your extra free time to kind of maintaining it, and that's not a sustainable model. So we need to think about what happens after projects. What is the collective responsibility of funding bodies, of institutions, to kind of keep the important bits of infrastructure, bits of code going? Who is responsible, and how do we kind of collectively decide which ones we gather around? So I think that's where the motivation is, to start gathering communities who can collectively decide these are things that are useful for us, and to collectively think about how we improve and maintain them. So this kind of brings us to the idea of the kind of a group of maintainers. If a tool and code base is genuinely useful for a community, it makes sense if we can identify that community and rally it so that we can think together about its definition of usefulness, the people who might want to use it for things we haven't thought about yet. And one of the things we should say about MapReader is that it was picked up by another project at Turing called SciVision, who they said, oh, great, we can use this for plant phenotype maps. We're like, what? But they had realized it could kind of spot elements of plants and kind of use that kind of ability to annotate with any concept that you see fit, and to then kind of automatically predict where it is in any kind of image. So that's where things come into their own. It helps us identify together use cases that we won't have seen, to think about where there could be future funding bids for the original team, but possibly new teams altogether to do things with that software. And also it thinks about actually how a wider community might be able to contribute to the code base, and even do bits of development that we had maybe had on the horizon but not got there because we didn't have the team or resources. So what might this look like? So we're thinking at the moment about how to push the communities around some selected pieces of software on 2 kind of fronts. So the first is kind of bringing up the rear, actually identifying the humanities community of people who maybe are digitally curious, but maybe not as kind of embedded, to tell them, look, this exists and we can train you how to use it. So we've got some different workshops coming up, and I'll share a QR code in a minute, but our first one is on MapReader, and that's going to be at the end of April or May. But the following ones introduce other tools. So we're going to be doing a workshop up in the north on MapReader and working with newspaper data. And then we're going to be doing another one back at the Turing in September on MapReader newspapers, and another piece of software that Daniel mentioned called TRES, which finds toponyms in text and disambiguates them and then geolocates them. It's kind of a pipeline. So the idea there is that we're kind of providing kind of 2 to 3 days of kind of intensive training for people to grow the community. And so if that sounds useful, that this is our first workshop, the QR code there. So I'll pause just briefly in case people want to photograph it. And we can get back to that. And then the other front we want to push on is the kind of people who have already said, yes, this is for us. We want to get involved. So we have something called a community call around MapReader at the moment. We're meeting every other month online for sort of 90 minutes. Next one's on 18th of April and 20th of June. And here we're getting demos from people who've already started using the MapReader software, discussing feature development priorities, brainstorming future documentation and tutorials. And we had like a really nice showing our last one of someone doing work on the Lake District. So it's really nice just to see someone picking it up and already doing something with it. And if you're interested in those events, we have a Slack space that you can sign up for using this QR code. So essentially what we're talking about today is a set of problems. You know, this is a work in progress. MapReader is a work in progress, but also the thinking about how we develop a model of growing sustainable communities is also a work in progress. And we really hope to be developing guidance for better practice and also documenting the barriers to that. Because of our funding model, we're in a position to be able to kind of make recommendations back to AHRC about how we can make digitally infected research more sustainable in the UK. And hopefully if we move beyond the pilot phase, which ends next March, we're sort of a year out from the end of the project, this could roll out to a longer term initiative where we can actually take these models and roll it out to lots of other projects so that we could kind of put that effort behind other projects that produce digital assets. So that's the aspiration if the pilot pays off, but it only works if people get involved. So we're really looking forward to the discussion today, because discussing this with our peers is really key to working out how we move forward in this area. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Daniel for talking about MapReader, and thanks to AHRC for our funding and the data culture team listed here.
Thanks so much. I think we are ready to open for discussions. Please feel free to post your question, comment, idea to the chat for people joining online and people also here in the room. Yes, Naomi.
Really interesting. Thanks so much for that. There was a point, because you mentioned, I was struck by you mentioning the UK data service, and I wondered on your perspective on whether, you know, we use infrastructure that has been created in other disciplines, whether it's in centres and area that came out of science, or whether we need to create specifically humanities infrastructure where you could sit on.
That's a really good question. I think those kind of examples are just a big pot you put stuff in, and actually finding your way usefully through it. You know, you kind of might go in with like some keywords, and so it's not necessarily a very useful. It means that the stuff is there, it's protected, but it doesn't really rely on the kind of findability issue. And I do wonder if in the humanities there's an additional challenge that people aren't necessarily thinking about data and code in the same ways. And so actually we're kind of asking a lot of our colleagues in a slightly more analog part of the discipline to do a lot of learning about what might even be out there. So I think that's also part of the barrier. It's not just about somewhere to put it. It's about findability and then educating the community about what's there, what might be useful, what might be the standout cases, because there's just so much. So that's not a very good answer, but I think Daniel might have some smart things to say.
Well, I don't know about that, but there is maybe one element of that to do with scale. It's a question of scale, like so much is about scale, and perhaps previous types of humanities infrastructure of that sort would have been catering for, say, an individual researcher to come and find one set of documents, or, you know, one type of thing that's manageable, like in the imagination of the person who designed it. the user would be an individual, one researcher, whereas in the sciences, perhaps people are already set up for very large kind of assets where you might be expected that, you know, a team of researchers, a lab's worth of people would be accessing it. So the nature of the access is different and the imagined use is different. I think it's changing now, obviously, because an individual humanities researcher might well want to download a terabyte of newspaper data. So I don't know whether that means things are converging more. I think probably it does. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that the kind of HRC's version of their data service was defunded before we even really got to the stage of needing repositories in the way that we need them now. So it was like it was ahead of its time and also behind its, you know, it's
yeah, just that education and the community changing humanities practices.
Everyone's just also really tired because their jobs are already kind of over demanding. So we're kind of thinking about an added burden to people finding things. So, you know, do you do that kind of due diligence of searching around these massive repositories and kind of GitHub when you're putting in a funding bid, and then spend the first year of your project reinventing the wheel because there actually was a solution over here?
Can I just, please.
That's a complicated set of thoughts, but I couldn't help but notice a bit of something was missing from research questions and how other people's research questions might affect.
Yeah.
And the other thing that struck me was the stories of humans. My experience is that historians are great at creating where different research questions intersect the same tools. I'm left wondering, struggling a little bit about how things like map reader, which in particular historical journalist person seems challenging to this patches method, which avoids the need to vectorize, but then also means you don't have a representation of connections between things,
yeah,
which is what a lot of traditional historical journalism is interested in. I imagine. As a historian, lots of other people who might be interested in a computer vision tool with real maps. I'm interested in flows, passages, connections. So things like transcribers, I think, have been very successful in building these communities. Traditional approaches, paleography, photography, have built, I think, very prosperous kind of communities of practice around it, because many people bring different research questions, tools, those archives, those massive things like that. You can bring many. So I'm not sure it's really a question, but
no. I'm also thinking about how to recap this for people who are not in the room because there's no microphone.
Where's the place for diverse research questions?
Yeah. So the question is, where's the place for diverse research questions in relation to the development of this software? Daniel, do you want to go as an actual historian?
I can offer a few things. No, I mean, those are all very good points. I think there is a question about canonical research objects, which, like you say, naturally attract like-minded people who will approach them in similar ways. And I think there's a bit of a fragmentation here where the kind of research object and the research method you work with are sort of separating a little bit. Mm-hmm. So as Ruth hinted, with MapReader, I mean, just as an aside, on the sort of vector sort of question, I mean, we very much wanted to do something that was different to the vector approach, not because that's not an important approach, but just because a vectorizing approach to maps, for instance, does lend itself to precisely, as you say, thinking about flows. So economic historians love to vectorize things because you can see how many of things there are going between places. And our research question was really not about flows or counting things that moved between places, but it was more about trying to capture sort of phenomenology, texture, the lived experience. So we wanted something that was about finding things, which was then interconnecting with other data sets, which in a way vectors aren't that well suited to doing, depending on how you go about it. We weren't, denying the importance of those maps for certain types of question. Our question was a bit different, but unexpectedly, the method that we developed began to find, I guess, salience for people doing completely other things, whose research objects were not our type of research object at all. It wasn't to do with Victorian landscapes. Someone from the national park wants to find dry stone walls. He's picked it up and is just using it, and it seemed quite effective for that. Likewise, plant phenotypes seem to be a type of image that, without our realizing it, actually works quite well with the tool. So it's something that really was designed for one research question, ended up at a certain point kind of taking on its own life because it seemed that other people might want to use it who we hadn't anticipated. I don't know how good a model that might be for other kind of projects, but we were fortunate in that we could at least develop it a little bit. And now we're at the point where if people want to pick it up and use it, we're delighted. And it's great.
Could I add something about in a kind of modular approach to kind of, because I think what you're suggesting is kind of the confluence of certain data types with certain methodologies. And so you do tend to get these kind of communities. So my background is in actually Renaissance letters. And funnily enough, lots of people who work on Renaissance letters really like network analysis because it's all about flow of information, right? And so there the kind of methodology really suits. But there are different modular ways you can kind of think about the relationship between data and method that allows you to do something completely new. And so we're really interested in that kind of thinking in a modular way about the future of research infrastructure, about when you bring this data type with this methodology, what kind of new direction does it unlock? And so I think, network analysis will take you in a very different direction with these maps, but this takes you in this direction, allows you to ask. And one of the things that we're interested in, we didn't do with this project, but we're kind of scoping with other people, is thinking longitudinally about landscape change over time. And again, it's really well suited to that because you can kind of then kind of take that kind of patchified approach to the landscape and look at kind of evolution over time. Yeah.
I mean, just on the communities point as well, and I think you're right that historians do congregate around certain questions and methods. And in a way, our hope, and this maybe was naive, was that there are historians who maybe want to try to think spatially that didn't quite realize they could with certain types of material, certain types of information. And if they become aware of this kind of thing, they could maybe, they can adapt the tool to a question of their own interest. And we tried to make it as versatile as possible. Now, clearly, it's not going to work for everyone's research question. It's just not appropriate. But I just think the community around this might form in a different way that cuts across, an early modern conference on this type of place versus something else. So it's trying to imagine a community whose intersections are, I guess, methodological rather than explicitly their research topic.
And that's what I think I was actually that there's an organic element to this which can't be forced.
Yeah.
But also some tools have some skills.
Yeah.
And I think what I was really talking about is really around skills, shared skills in using where same skill.
Yeah.
Which is where transcripts is so successful because so many stories can see.
Yeah. Yes, it's a very cool project.
So so many different people can quite quickly see those. But I think that's what we're flagging here is perhaps a need to flag the potential.
And in an abstract, the potential is quite abstract. You need people to kind of grasp that kind of abstract way that it goes across domains. The comment was about, for people who aren't in the room, that Transcribus has kind of really obvious applications because historians immediately get how they can apply it in the archive.
I mean, just quickly, just another comment back. I mean, Transcribus is an interesting case study as well because of their funding model now. So they've tried to make themselves sustainable by charging, having a pricing model for different types of service. That's had some kind of hostile reception from certain people who feel upset to have to pay for it now. But I guess it is a realistic question they're kind of throwing out there, which is like, how are we going to sustain and fund these things? And we don't really have a any plans or prospect of us like creating sort of any sort of pricing model for any of our tools. That wasn't we're funded by the HRC, apart from anything else. But it does raise the question of how to continue this stuff, and it's a long running question that the DH obviously wrestled
And
with.
even when it's really clearly recognized as a valuable thing in the community, it doesn't necessarily mean it can be maintained without without a kind of a financial kind of model.
Can I ask something on the mechanics of the workshops and of the project in general? I was wondering, you made the project that you just mainly about nurturing and creating a community of users of existing tools. So actually, promoting the tool and cultivating awareness around this tool. Are you also thinking about creating workshops or some sort of community around creating new tools? So fitting from let's say researchers' needs. For example, new research ideas for new software. So what's the sustainability plan for the actual project in that direction in terms of the community building exercise?
Yeah, I don't know if people can hear out of the room, but that was a question about what about tools that don't exist yet. How do we, I mean, that's outside the scope of this project. I think they really want to think about building communities around things that already exist. But I can imagine a similar project that kind of does like a scoping exercise, but that's quite a different fish. I mean, I think we've got that kind of model in between that we're thinking about. How could these tools be developed out? So what are kind of future kind of iterations of them? That requires other people to kind of pick up the baton and think about spin out bids to develop those. So this is really what the community calls are kind of focusing on, and I think that's kind of the middle ground. But brand new tools that meet the needs of the community, no, not at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, it'd be great if somebody wants to fund that and spends time doing it. I mean, obviously that'd be amazing. But it's not. Our
research application manager, I think, is really important there, because again, where researchers are kind of thinking, we're kind of communicating sideways and kind of translating across communities that we've kind of got really used to working with software engineers, and we've got we've got used to kind of communicating that direction, and now we're thinking about how do you create community awareness, and those are again like a whole new set of skills, and I think you need people who are kind of tailored to those kind of scoping activities. But it's a new category of thing that I didn't know about until recently, the research application manager. But it's a very valuable set of skills. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, the only other thought I had about that, not to push back against the question, but slightly, I would say that there is a lot of emphasis on newness quite a lot of the time, new techniques, new methods. I mean, we've obviously been doing new methods. But at the same time, I think the pace of development of software is much faster than the ability of humanities researchers to actually make use of it. So in some ways, I'd rather there wasn't any new development just yet, because I think we haven't even scratched the surface of what you can do with computer vision tools that already exist, let alone language models. I mean, we haven't mentioned that today at all, but that's obviously a highly active area of research at the moment for other reasons than historical research. And historians are kind of dipping their feet into that pool. Mix my metaphor slightly there, but I think there's so much to do with language models that have been superseded 2-3 years ago already. Historians have done a little bit of work exploring text data with basic language models, but before that work has really percolated to other researchers in the field and been evaluated and discussed and disseminated, we're already sort of 3 or 4 generations of language model ahead now, and there's no sense of what might have been possible against what might be possible now. So I just think in some ways I'd quite like people to slow down a little bit and just make use of what's there in a slightly more rigorous and thorough way before jumping.
That's a good point.
So we
have talked about like the kind of like the the cost of constantly developing new, and quite often, if something gets you 70% of the way there, maybe that's enough.
Yeah.
And I don't think our questions are always, you know, we don't always need to kind of operationalize every step. If the 70% gets us most of the way there, and then we can do the rest more manually. So I think we need to think practically about like actual human hours that go into the development of these things. And I'm like looking at people in the room who like literally spent a year like working on a pipeline for something. And so you have to really work out what the payoff is. And sometimes it is an amazing data set, an amazing pipeline. But I think we need to make really pragmatic decisions about, you know, we're spending public money, we're spending people's time, we're spending people's sanity. So when the thing that already exists is good enough.
I just want to welcome also questions for people that they're joining online. Please post your question in the Q&A chats, and please.
So I work for the National Museums Lab at Birkbeck, and we build a data set which is open sourced. There's code, there's open access, but I think realistically there is a kind of community for that resource, which only accesses the data through the website.
Yeah.
But this is the sort of thing that sustainability, maintenance, funding, because we know there's a community that uses it. I think to some extent it's influenced policy, which is great. But then it's written in Python, code gets obsolete, and we know people want to use it, we want to keep using it because we keep updating the data.
Yeah.
But when you approach the community and say, hey, would you like to fund this thing that you use? And get into the article, so we can't be done. So there's a desire around it. Again, this was IHRC funded. It's the same issue, like project stops, the funding stops. So we have kind of institutional goodwill where somebody says, well, okay, we'll keep this running for 500 years on a very sort of minimal, intervention. But something I think is pretty good.
Yeah.
So this isn't really a question, it's just going to show we have similar problems.
Just for people who aren't in the room, this is a question around especially online resources, people who are kind of accessing via a website interface and unwillingness to pay for that thing and when does something like that fall over? I mean, this is so many humanities projects, because I think especially in humanities, we kind of know that people need to access via an interface, because accessing the data in its raw form is like, they don't necessarily have the skills to do that. But I'm thinking about a project at Queen Mary, and my colleague, she has this little guy in Russia who she pays this minimal amount of money every few years to kind of rebuild a thing, and she's scrabbling around for bits of money. But it's a data set that lots of people in the community, there's a proper community around it. But when that thing falls over, so now it's what's the thing called? The words are failing me, where it's kind of it's in an environment where it's kind of a container where all the dependencies are, but it can't be updated. It's just kind of fixed in time, and so this is a repeated issue in the humanities communities. And so I think we need to think a little bit again, in a kind of component based way, about what does the minimal version look like. So the data set that you can join with this thing and this thing, the kind of but then you probably need researchers then need someone to kind of, if there's from a very kind of analog background, to kind of guide them through that process. So we kind of need to think ahead to what that kind of more modular lo-fi version might look like, and whether actually we need to be kind of looking to the AHRC to say, actually, in the future, we want to be offering this suite of data sets with these sets of tools to manipulate them. But we need to be thinking in a really strategic way about actually what are the kind of minimal number of things that we can support to provide maximal access to things that we've invested in the past.
I think something that would be great is a kind of maintenance fund,
Yeah, NEH I think has that, like the NEH, like a small amount of money just to kind of maintain things, because often it doesn't require much. Yeah, Daniel?
I mean, the only thing just to add is there is a kind of movement to have sort of low resource computation, where, you know, for certain conferences and things, you can there's kind of category of things which are minimal computing, yeah. And in a way, like, that's always been imagined or envisaged as something like for other people, but actually maybe that's just us, and that's just how we should think about stuff. Makes it more easy to sustain, perhaps.
Your recipe book that comes with the, you know, like, if you put this into this, do this and this, you get this. And, no, there's meal kits, yeah.
I just want to say I really enjoyed all of your comments. I agree with them so much. But I just had a question about, you know, all this community outreach is absolutely great. Quite a lot of work to do, but I found that there is still sometimes a very resistant part of the community who's kind of going like, no, we don't want to learn these skills. Or, you know, oh yes, we'll use this, but only if it is in the most like user-friendly form. That's also the most expensive to maintain, funnily enough. It's getting better, I think, as, you know, more and more people understand the power of these tools and, you know, what they can do for them. But do you have any advice for kind of how to, you know, win out against this resistance and convince people that it is honestly worth their time?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was around how do you win over hearts and minds? What, how do you win over kind of resistant parts of the community? Do you want to go first? I've got some thoughts as well.
I mean, I have no easy answer to that. I mean, maybe it helps if, I mean, we had a discussion at the AHA about this, and someone was saying, well, you imagine learning Python is equivalent to learning a language as a historian. You know, you have to learn French if you want to do French history. If you want to do computational history, you have to learn Python. And you can't make someone learn Latin or French or German if they're not willing to make that effort. So I don't see how you can sort of, you know, make people do it. You're right. I mean, stuff that's easier to use is more difficult to maintain. And we were very clear in Never with Machines, we were never going to produce a front-end website search interface. That was, you know, people kept asking, oh, how can I search all the newspapers? Because it just was never a thing we were in the game of trying to do because of the reasons you mentioned. But in a way, we have just deferred the problem one stage to the level of code and you know, other resources where it will just fall apart eventually. So,
yeah. I mean, I think I found that people are won over most when you show research applications. So when people see something work through from beginning to end, and they see the thing that comes out at the end of the machine that looks like the kind of research answer they would like to get to, I think that's actually the most compelling evidence you can give people. And I think so much of the digital humanities still exists in the language of potential. And so when you kind of actually give people an end product that looks like historical research, but you got there through a kind of computational process, I think that is a really compelling piece of evidence. But I do think properly designed workshops that are sustained. So I did a project called Networking Archives, which was on like network analysis methods for looking at early modern letters and other data sets. And what we did is we held it over 3 separate events. It was like 3 days times 3. It was really intensive, but it meant that we took an entire community with us. I think it was 15 people, but we guided them from like entry level. This is a data structure, this is data cleaning, this is a network analysis tool. And like we took them from kind of really easy network analysis tools to actually a bit of Python coding. And then we found the people within that group who actually really wanted to do some bespoke stuff, and we kind of helped them write code and went all the way through to like designing a special issue of a journal with them. And that as a community that as kind of sustained, but it like took a lot of work because we just had to design a curriculum. We did mentoring, we co-wrote code with people. We ended up like doing co-authored publications with some of them. But those are people using the code, reusing the data. So it's like a really intensive model. But I think if you really want to grow a particular piece of software or a community around a particular, you kind of need that intensive model. I don't know. It's effective, but really expensive in many different senses of the word.
I was just about to ask if you want to follow up. Just how many people do you have kind of working on that and supporting?
Oh yeah, so we had, so me and one of the other co-investigators ran it from the technical perspective. Then we had a couple of postdocs who were kind of keeping the room sane. And then we had a couple of like we invited in a couple of like guest faculty. So it was the team doing a lot of work. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you need a funded project or a department who like wants to kind of invest in those kinds of things.
I will just say, just to reiterate something Ruth has already mentioned, but I'll just repeat it, which is at the Turing, there's a particular kind of person who doesn't really exist in the world of humanities research, which are these research application managers, RAMs, or community managers, as sometimes called. And it's quite a kind of common thing in the natural sciences that these tools and libraries, it's just understood that they require not just maintenance, but outreach and communication and development of the community. And it's a role that someone has who is a very talented, capable person, both in the world of coding and also people, and they bring the two together. And
Rare combination skills.
And they're very busy and they're very good at it and they make it work. And that doesn't really exist. People don't put budget lines in for that in their projects in the humanities, and they should. I don't know how easy it is. Well, in fact, it's not. It's really hard even to get one for us, but we're hoping to have one, and that will help with some of the sort of background work you mentioned.
That made me think, though. I mean, there's a lot of like discussion at the kind of policy level about, do we need a pool of software, research software engineers that kind of serve the UK in terms of humanities projects, right? Or maybe there is a category as well of kind of research application managers that, if we're imagining like a national institute, and I don't know if the AHRC isn't, I don't think necessarily still thinking in this direction, but it was like a discussion at one point. Again, do we need that kind of centralized, not centralized, but even kind of aggregated or disaggregated network of people serving in that way? That would be a really interesting model of investment, wouldn't it?
Just add a quick comment on this. I think that's this project is a great example of why we should think of infrastructure more kind of in a more comprehensive way. So infrastructure is not just the systems or like the actual material instances of the infrastructure, but more importantly, as you said, is the people that they're going to use the software, the tools, the code that we're creating, but also people that they're going to actually maintain the culture that we're building within this software and tools. And I was, I'd like to ask you, how do you, I think that, this project is one of the rare examples of a project that is something like a meta project. So you said that you built it like, you had the Living with the Machine as a pilot project for this project, or like the other way.
Okay, yeah.
So I would like to, ask you, how do you think that, is this probably the future for digital humanities or humanities funding? So we're gonna, most probably going to ask for not only innovative, let's say, research projects, but more importantly, projects that they're gonna do this, not only good practice, but better practice, and more importantly, like sustainable practice. So do you think that this is the way?
I'm going to try and recap the question. There was a comment about infrastructure not being about technical components, but also about people, shared knowledge, and expertise kind of flowing. And then the question was about what's the future of funding? Is it not just about innovative research, but about sustainable communities infrastructure? I don't know. So from what I understand, the HRC kind of imagines it has like two pots of money. And so it's got its it funds research projects, but it does have an infrastructure pot, and it's funded us from an infrastructure pot for this pilot. And so they are thinking about different models of delivery. So I don't necessarily know if we're the future of funding, but I think they are thinking about this kind of cross-cutting initiative. So in terms of like the relationship of living machines to this project, living with machines wasn't really an infrastructure project. I mean, and we very consciously at the outset said we weren't doing infrastructure because the Turing didn't want to maintain. There was no kind of ability to maintain beyond the end of the project because of all of the problems we know in the UK with that kind of issue of sustainability. And so it was really about pushing research innovation in terms of historical questions, but also research innovation in terms of like methodological innovation. And this is really, as you say, a meta project, and we've taken some components from living machines as test cases to think about how you go about thinking about sustainability. So I think it's coming from a different pot and a different kind of group within the AHRC. And that infrastructure money comes from UKRI, and AHRC only very recently qualified for it. So this is a new venture for them, and so they're really kind of feeling their way in terms of it's the first time they've had access to that money, and they need to scope how they scaffold research in the UK. So I think they're thinking it through projects like ours. So I think they want to see how well we do, and then they'll decide. Yeah.
Just to add one thing is also that the Living with Machines project is one of the, if you like, case studies of the data culture, but there's another one. So it's actually one of two. So our bit, if you like, is one half of the project, and the other half is a very different kind of digital history project called SESHAT, which is a sort of global data bank project, which takes a very different approach, and it's a very different kind of example of what you can do with digital approaches. So the two are kind of running together to produce.
Again, for communities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's got the same kind of aim to try and see how far it can develop a sustainable community around those research aims. I think the longer term aim beyond the pilot would be something like, if I can sort of try and capture it, is to imagine a situation where a project or a structure like this would bring in other research projects and skill them up and tool them up as well in producing better practice in terms of all those things you mentioned, code and everything else. So there might be a kind of revolving cast of research that kind of came in and made use of the expertise and the infrastructure, and then was able to go back out into the world with it, if you like. I think that's roughly the idea.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Like that.
Yeah, any more questions, comments? So from people sharing online. Any other points to make? I mean, it was great, to hear about the project. Thanks also for the QR code and with the workshop details. I think that's a good thing to have for our calendars if you're interested to join. On that note, we're gonna wrap the seminar a bit early this time. Thank you, Ruth and Daniel, for joining us today. Thank you all for joining in person and online. And yes, looking forward to seeing you to the next seminar.